The penultimate point, teach children to empathise. This is very, very important indeed. Most of you will have heard about what's come to be known as the James Bulger case, yes? And you know very well that James Bulger was murdered by two very small boys. And I heard a discussion about this on the radio after the trial and after the two boys had been sentenced. And someone made the point that the trouble was that the two boys had not been brought up to know, to appreciate, to understand the difference between right and wrong. And it was for that reason that they committed that particular terrible crime. But there was a woman psychologist taking part in this discussion, and she disagreed. She disagreed. She pointed out that the two boys had been found guilty of murder, and that they had been sentenced for murder, and that it had been ascertained that they knew the difference between right and wrong, and that was why they'd been found guilty of murder and not just of manslaughter. They knew the difference between right and wrong. And she made the point, the very important point, that it wasn't enough to know the difference between right and wrong. One has to be able to empathise with other people, with other children, with other people generally, with other living beings. Otherwise, one's recognition of the difference between right and wrong would be a purely, as it were, abstract, mechanical sort of thing, which would not necessarily influence your behaviour. So children have to be taught to empathise with other children. You can't, of course, give a lesson in empathy. You can't have it as part of the school curriculum. Here again, perhaps, the example of parents will come in. Children can be taught, I think, quite easily to empathise with animals, to feel, to realise that, well, animals do feel pain just in the way that they do. I remember there's an incident in the Pali Canon where the Buddha finds some boys tormenting a crow. Tormenting a crow. So, what did the Buddha say? This is quite interesting. He said to the boys, well, look, if you were tormented in that way, how would you feel? And of course they said, well, we wouldn't like it, we'd feel pain. And the Buddha said, well, if you would feel pain when tormented in that way, don't you think that the crow feels pain when you're tormenting it like that? And of course they had to admit that, yes, that was the case. They started empathizing with the crow. So we have to teach children to empathize with others. Empathize with animals, empathize with other children, eventually empathize with all living beings. So this is very important. I remember again seeing that well-known series, or famous series of engravings by Hogarth called The 4 Stages of Cruelty. Those of you who are artists may be familiar with it. The first stage of cruelty is some boys tormenting a dog and a cat. That's the first stage of cruelty. And of course, the next stage of cruelty is one of the boys committing a murder. And the next stage of cruelty after that is the boy who committed the murder being hung. And the next stage of cruelty after that, well, his body is being dissected by some surgeons. But the message seems to be that it starts, this is what Hogarth seems to be saying, that this life of violence, ending in the experience of violence by oneself, when one is executed, just begins with tormenting animals, a lack of empathy for animals, a lack of empathy with other living things. Some people, of course, are so sensitive that they feel an empathy even with plants, even with flowers. And this is quite practicable. Some people don't even like to pluck flowers because they feel that the flower is being injured in some way. Well, not everybody will be able to empathise to that extent, but we should at least empathise with animals and with other human beings. So this is one of the most important things that we have to teach our children, so to speak, teach them to empathise.